So I just found a old webcam, so it's a little bit easier for me to do video, and as a result of that, I thought I would do a response video to King Critical and his debate with Vaush. I've already seen it, and that's why I'm kind of thinking it would be useful to do a response.
Awesome. Great. Hi.
Howdy.
I just need to, good to talk to you.
Yeah, I love talking
How
to
are
you.
you?
I'm doing great. All right, you should probably be careful with your niceties now, because historically my conversations with people of your political disposition don't tend to go very well.
Can you see me, by the way? I'm just wondering. I turned it on instinctively.
Yeah, he's like, well, I don't know. You could interpret that a number of different ways, but he couldn't allow for the possibility that the conversation would go well and there would be a kind of mutual understanding, and that there could, or any sort of mutual understanding, because essentially this is it's masquerading as a debate, but it's more akin to, it's the UFC versus professional wrestling. If the UFC is a debate, this is professional wrestling. Lots of people do it. Probably one of the most famous examples is Jesse Lee Peterson. You can see why he can be entertaining when you get into a certain mode. He's talented at what he does. But what he does is not debate somebody. It's a little bit like, I guess they do it now more with, in the new episodes of Sesame Street, but in the oldest episodes of Sesame Street, you couldn't have a shot of Elmo walking around from behind because the puppet wasn't kind of built that way. Yeah, these are kind of puppet shows that require the set and all the shit that goes around it, the context, to work.
I don't know.
I can see you. Do you want me to throw you up on stream?
Yeah, you can. Yeah, that's fine.
I'll do that.
All right, cool.
All right. So hit me up. I have not yet had the time to watch your video. Give me your criticisms. I'm ready for that.
Oh, no. I see. You would want me to give you my criticism. Unfortunately, the video I made about you it's not very useful. It's not very kind of conducive to good discussion, mostly because your video was about J.K. Rowling. And I don't, thoroughly endorse J.K. Rowling. My bigger interest is in the wider idea. And more specifically, the reason why I would agree with someone like J.K. Rowling is because I think, what is it that you think queer theory, which is to say the idea that gender is determined 100% by self-identity, what does that idea explain or make clearer about gender and about kind of feminist discourse? How does that help have a more robust feminist discourse?
I'm not sure if it's about having a more robust discourse as it is about mitigating harm and most accurately identifying the way in which people engage with gender.
Okay, see, that's interesting. I thought you might say that. See, for me, that's not very helpful, because it's basically saying that it's a very utilitarian way of looking at things, to say, the reason why we should believe a certain thing or affirm a certain truth is because it's going to make people happier. And I think that could easily, you would surely think, lead to all sorts of potential issues down the line, where somebody can just say, oh, that doesn't... But see, for me...
Well, the thing is, and you have to remember, there is no inherent truth of gender. We didn't discover gender somewhere in a forest. It's a social construct. It is what we make of it. So in the process of reshaping it to better suit human need, we're doing what social constructs are meant to do, to serve human needs. There's not some inherent truth value we have to, respect or dig up.
Okay, yeah, I get what you're saying. So in other words, I would disagree on your definition of what, or your assessment of what a social construct should do. I don't think a social construct is there to to help humans, to make things nice for humans. I think this construct is there to better facilitate, and something I do think it's there to help. I think it's there to better facilitate dialogue, to better facilitate understanding the world. And I don't think it's helpful to take an idea and that is very useful, that is a theory or an understanding of a concept, and say, well, we need to change that in order to make other people happier.
Yeah, but why would Okay, hold on. So
Okay,
wait. So let's back up at this. Okay, hold on.
Yeah, that's fine.
So understanding of what? Gender is,
Right.
as we both agree, a social construct. There's no fundamental truth to understand. It is only a system that we have devised to explain patterns in our world. The extent to which we understand it is contingent upon its perceived existence. If to us, gender is nothing more than a system of self-identification, then if we understand it to be that, our understanding is as significant as any level of understanding could be of a more essentialist view of gender.
Right, yeah, okay.
My rebuttal to that, I guess, would be... Let me go back again.
It is only a system that we have devised to explain patterns in our world. The extent to which we understand it is contingent upon its perceived existence. If to us, gender is nothing more than a system of self-identification, then if we understand it to be that, our understanding is as significant as any level of understanding could be of a more essentialist view of gender.
Right, okay. Okay, so people have pointed out that he's reading at this point, which doesn't really matter. That's besides the point. So his idea that social constructs are sort of brought into the world by humans in terms of like the way an idea happens is someone thinks, hey, we should do it this way. And then depending on how popular that is, or a variety of other sort of contributing factors, if it takes off, that becomes like, the social understanding, and that's how various concepts get created. And so the idea is like, well, if there's a concept, then we can just completely rewrite it, because the only thing that matters is that somebody thinks these things, and so we can just stop them from thinking them or change how they think by changing the concept. That makes sense, and I think there's a few things that are sort of unclear as the debate goes on, but I have somewhat of an understanding of historical materialism and Marxism. So from my understanding, a Marxist conception of and a historical materialist conception of history says that it's actually how society makes things that produces the ideas that happen in a society. Like the classic example of talking about this is racism, because racism didn't really exist in the context that we understand it up until about, rough guess, like 600 years ago, maybe 300, because you didn't have imperialism, and racism was essentially a ideological justification for imperialism. So the material thing came first, of like, we're sailing around the world taking shit, grabbing people, and then the ideological thing came later. This is okay because the Bible says, and they're dirty or whatever. So that's the kind of flawed idea that liberals put forward, is that actually racism comes from people thinking racist thoughts. It doesn't come out of racist material relations. It comes out of individual bad people thinking bad things, and then that somehow kind of evolving into a collective response. So this is why people argue that to be colorblind and decide that there is an old social construct of noticing race, and I'm going to try and encourage lots of people to abolish this by simply not seeing race, what that actually does, even though race itself isn't a real thing, is it obscures the fact that it can be made real by material relations. So these people have this land and we want it. Now there's a material reason for racism. And just saying, I don't see race isn't going to fix it. And in the same way, there is oppression that manifests itself as gender, in the same way there's oppression that manifests itself as race. And by just going, well, that's a bad way to think about gender, let's think up something else, you're actually not understanding really how gender is working in the first place. That's what I would argue. That there's this defense that comes up later of, oh, but I can understand everything, I can understand everything. And I'll address it more then, but I feel like everybody knows the kind of purpose of different philosophical schools of thought. And the concept of lenses is like you see different things when you look at the world through a different lens. Yeah, so if you look at it from a Marxist perspective, then you're going to see class things. If you look at it from a feminist perspective, then you're going to see sex. And then if you look at it from a racist perspective or the perspective of race, then you're going to see racial dynamics. And the kind of scam that postmodernism does, and this is where like queer theory comes from, is it tries to pretend like it isn't a lens. It tries to pretend like, well, we're just seeing everything at once. And it's essentially akin to saying, like, we have a direct line to God and we don't actually have a lens. We're, like, experiencing the world kind of directly, and we're these kind of priests that can, in our, like, postmodern babble, tell you how the world works instead. Yeah, anyway, we'll get to that, I guess.
Right, yeah, okay. I get what you're saying, but the thing is, I would say it is, and I understand what you're saying, that basically it doesn't really exist, it's something made up. But I would say that we made it up. And it's really useful for looking at things, most particularly, especially if you're a progressive, I think, looking at the oppression of women and basically understanding feminism. And I would say that the minute that you start saying, well, actually...
He looks confused because he doesn't understand that concept of gender. He's like, gender wasn't invented to study oppression. Gender was invented to express oneself. This is a problem. There's a video, I'll have to find it, but it talks about the way that the word gender can mean essentially 3 different things depending on how it's being used, but people use it interchangeably, and you can tell in a conversation, everyone will just be saying gender, 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 but they'll be meaning 3 different things, and it'll be obvious each person isn't aware of when it's shifting. So to begin with, the first way gender is used is as a synonym with sex, essentially. So what's your gender? And then the next way that it's used is, it's like ideas about sex. Yeah, so that's like sex role stereotypes. What a particular sex, the expectations that are socially forced onto a particular sex. And that people will call that gender too. And then there's like feelings about ideas about gender, being like how you feel about the sex role stereotypes that are imposed on your sex. And that feeling will also be called gender. And so in these conversations, you'll have, people using those 3 terms interchangeably without differentiating them. And I feel like the confused look on Vaush's face is as a result of the tension that's coming from this not having been unpacked, because he's not looking to understand, I feel. He's done, to my credit, to Vaush's credit, I feel like he has been listening better than I remember. The debate deteriorates, and so I felt like it was completely negative the whole way through, and it is. There's that seething hostility, but yeah, there's a little bit more openness than I remember.
I, right now, could self-identify as a woman, and suddenly I become the subject of feminism. Patriarchy becomes something that affects me as a woman. That feminism should focus on my rights as a woman. I think at that point you've then taken away the utility of that construct in deconstructing patriarchy.
This is the lie that all TERFs propagate. The idea that the self-identification theory of gender in any way destroys our ability to understand power relations or meaningfully address the experience that assigned female at birth people go through. I've interacted with a lot of trans people in my life. I mean, a lot. I have never met any of them who believe that a cis and a trans person, or cis and a trans woman or man, are identical in every way, or that the experiences of a cis woman in youth are the same as a trans woman's youth. I have never met a person like that. And I have never been in a trans space and not been able to talk about the difference in these experiences.
This is a complete dodge, and it's very selective. And I feel like he's reading again. I wonder if he's writing his own stuff. I hope he is. You don't write your own bars? Pocket check. Let's go back and hear it again.
I've never been in a trans...
Oh, yeah, it's never been in a trans space. Like, all my trans friends think this, is apparently an argument. But also what he does is he frames he's like, you're concerned about the oppression of women. I've never been in a trans space and had that idea, like the oppression of women, rejected. And it's like, first of all, do you think that's because you're a man? Do you think that's because you have a YouTube channel of, significant clout in your community? Like, there's a whole bunch of different reasons why I'm sure your ideas wouldn't get any pushback from the broader trans community. But when lesbians and detransitioners try to talk about the oppression of women as distinct from the oppression of trans women,
any way destroys our ability to understand power relations or meaningfully address the experience that assigned female at birth people go through. I've interacted with...
He says, thinking this way doesn't mean you can't meaningfully address the oppression that women face. And his evidence for that is that when he goes into trans spaces, he's not looked down upon for bringing up the issues that women face separately to trans women. What would have been interesting is if King Critical had pushed back in this area just to say, what is it? What do you think there are differences? Because he also says they have differences in childhood. That's a widely accepted thing that all trans people accept, suggesting that these people don't believe that there's any difference between a cis woman's adulthood and a trans woman's, meaningful difference between a cis woman's adulthood and a trans woman's adulthood. So even the fact that he's going like, yeah, we've got that. It's like, do you really understand the different points? I feel like if he was being honest about it, there would be a kind of explanation of like, for instance, a big concern is women's prisons. The very valid kind of concerns that women have about sharing prison spaces with male-bodied people, or sports, or, he would have actually addressed it, but he couldn't. His attempt at addressing it was, when I say this shit in trans spaces, no one tells me to shut up. Yeah, that's just about social standing. It could be about being male. It's most definitely about being white.
With a lot of trans people in my life. I mean, a lot. I have never met any of them who believe that a cis and a trans person, or cis and a trans woman or man, are identical in every way, or that the experiences of a cis woman in youth are the same as a trans woman's youth. I have never met a
Except when they're stealing sporting achievements.
Person like that. And I have never been in a trans space and not been able to talk about the difference in these experiences. The idea that we're sanding over distinctions is just not the case. I've never seen this happen.
Like, this would be the perfect time for him to offer an example of one of the distinctions that he's not sanding over, but he just kind of offers these very minor kind of differences. Oh, yeah, we acknowledge the differences such as, like, girlhood. But, yeah, he can't name any of them. Instead, all he has is to say, the idea that we don't acknowledge the differences, none of which I've mentioned so far, is preposterous.
Or that outright statement. The idea that we are harming cisgender women, or real women, as some of them might say, by obfuscating the difference between trans and cis people, which is, I mean, it's silly. We're just saying trans women are women. There's not much else to it.
Yeah, I understand where you're coming from.
Which is silly because we're just saying trans women are women, like, yeah, but you're not just saying trans women are women and we can have a logical discussion. You're saying trans women are women. They can't be distinguished in any ways, even the most insane ways, even in ways that do pose a threat to cis women, because cis women are the, oppressors now of these male-bodied people. So whenever there is a conflict between their interests, cis women have to lose because otherwise you're being transphobic. So you're never actually able to consider their differences because your understanding of patriarchy, as will be demonstrated, is super shallow. Patriarchy seems to come from nowhere in particular. It's not perpetrated by a particular group, or maybe cis people perpetrate it, I don't know. And then it also kind of affects everyone basically evenly. So it's a bizarre conception, but we'll get to that in a second.
I mean, you stated this elsewhere. You said, and I've heard other people say this, that black women have a different experience to white women, and lesbian women have a different experience to straight women. But I think the fundamental point is that you understand patriarchy as something where men have oppressed women, and that this has always taken a similar form of being, to a significant extent, based on biology. Now, I'm not an essentialist, and I think a lot of gender critical people are not essentialists. I don't believe that it's all 100% about biology, and I think that even
this also wasn't made clear enough. The unpacking what essentialist means. The mistake that gender theists make when they talk about or biological determinism, for example, which is sometimes used as a synonym for essentialism, is that they think that if you're talking about biology at all, then that's biological determinism, which is not the case. Biological determinism is when you think that someone's biology is what is determining their behavior, which is kind of ironic because that's often what gender theists argue, that they were born with specific biology that's producing a specific identity. That is biological determinism. But the difference with gender atheists or gender critical people is that they're understanding that sex is given a political characteristic under patriarchy in the same way like skin color or geographic origin is given a political character under imperialism. So they're saying black skin has a political character. They're not saying black skin makes you do something. And in the same way, feminists, depending on who you talk to, aren't saying female biology makes you do a certain thing. They're saying it's been politicized in a certain way. That wasn't clear enough. What I meant by makes you do a certain thing is your biology compels you to feel motivated to behave in a certain way. Obviously, your biology does make you do certain things to the extent that, you produce sperm or ovaries. But biological determinism usually refers to people believing that social roles are biologically determined.
100% about biology. And I think that even things outside of biology can determine gender.
Yeah, and that this wasn't really unpacked properly in this discussion, so I feel, it should have been.
But biology has a huge part in it. And, you're saying, well, we can understand the struggles of women.
Yeah, that's too vague. Biology has a big part in it. That could be interpreted so many different ways, which is okay because I don't feel like I would have done any better.
Who also happen to have a broadly female biology, while also understanding that some women have penises. And certainly I agree you can, but I would argue, is that the best way to understand what patriarchy is in terms of the historic oppression?
Patriarchy affects everyone, regardless of biology.
That's not true. Well, okay. Patriarchy does affect everyone regardless of biology. However, it does so in the same way that racism affects everybody, regardless of race. Yeah, I always think of like the Swing Kids because it's a classic example of that type of thing. Like they were listening to jazz music in Nazi Germany, and so they were persecuted by the Nazi regime, but they weren't Jewish and they weren't black. It was just a cultural thing. And you could say like, oh, so then everybody was affected. Like, what about white people that like jazz during Nazi Germany? And it's like, yeah, everyone's affected. Everyone's affected by imperialism. Everyone's affected by capitalism. But who is oppressed by patriarchy is specifically females, because the specific purpose of patriarchy is to create heirs in order to create inheritance, in order for class to be a thing. That's the like material basis of patriarchy. And no one's femininity has ever created an heir. Only a womb can do that. In the same way, you can be really into black culture, but unless you actually have indigenous land or historical land or some kind of actual connection to it, then you're not the subject of the imperialism.
Like, patriarchy affects toxic masculinity and the way that straight men experience life. Patriarchy significantly affects gay men, and they aren't oppressed by their biology. They're men. Even the beefiest, hunkiest, big muscle, colossal, beefy, gorilla-dicked gay men are still affected negatively by social conceptions relating to the patriarchy. And nobody, not even TERFs, would go up to these people and say, well, the patriarchy never affected you. No, of course not. Now,
but why is going up to them? Why would you go up to them? Heaps of people have actually argued, and this was a common understanding in the left up until postmodernism and queer theory took over, was that the oppression of homosexuals was an outgrowth of the oppression of women. And that was how most people understood it. And so that was also, I guess, like one of the reasons why lesbians were the more kind of progressive of the group, because they were facing the double oppression of being women and being gay. It's just funny that group was like always the most down with every kind of progressive cause, and capitalism couldn't really figure out a way to fuck with them until this TERF thing. And then suddenly the group that had been like the backbone of the gay liberation struggle were now like the enemies of the state. It's a very effective move.
There is an element of patriarchal oppression that is rooted in the biological dimorphism between cisgender men and cisgender women. That's definitely the case.
Yeah, he's like, there's an element of the oppression. So I imagine in his head what he's talking about is like the fact that guys are, yeah, it'd be like they've got bigger muscles, they've got, testosterone, blah, blah, blah. That causes, some punching that shouldn't happen or whatever. But that's not what patriarchy is. Patriarchy isn't just hating women, it's farming them.
But we are not, that's not being sanded over with the acknowledgement that trans women are still women.
These nothing points aren't being sanded over. That's wonderful.
And most trans women end up getting subjected to a lot of the same physiological disparities that cisgender women do.
They get subjected to the same physiological disparities. What does that even mean?
If you talk to like a trans woman who's been living as a woman for some time, they're going to be social constructs. There's no truth value to pursue. You just have
social contracts don't exist to stop people feeling upset. The reason why we have the social construct of race, and the reason why it's very useful for progressives to understand the construct of race and have a very clear understanding of what race is beyond just self-identity or anything like that, is because it helps us to understand the oppression, both historical and today, of people of colour. The reason why we have the construct of gender is because it helps us to understand the oppression, both historical and current, of
we have a better understanding now of the racial dynamics of the Roman Empire, even though our current understanding of race has nothing to do with that of the Roman Empire. You don't need to preserve oppressive social constructs to continue to understand them. There's no relationship.
But you do need to understand them to continue to understand them. And the assumptions of queer theory are kind of at odds with understanding how the world works. For example, the idea that ideas are what changes the world is an example of how it can become muddy when you have two different conceptions of gender, basically. One that's going to exist so long as the material conditions remain the same, and one that's never going to be relevant or never going to be like the dominant idea so long as the conditions stay the same.
What then? Should we keep racism? Racism is a social construct.
Yeah, so he's essentially been able to steal Critical's point and turn it into his own.
And by preserving racism, we preserve and amber the relations between...
Because the point isn't not to... yeah, wow. He's reading, but this is in response to something that Critical has just said. So maybe there's like a team of writers. I don't know, maybe he takes notes and that's why it's written out like that.
Black and white people, making it easier for us to understand the way in which these groups interact with one another. Social.
But you don't, okay, here's the difference. You're saying don't get rid of the keep the concept of race, and believe it. But what you're suggesting is kind of like, to make the analogy from gender to race, what Vaush is suggesting is that in conditions where racism exists, you could potentially undermine it simply by coming up with a different conception of race and trying to ignore or downplay the old conception of race, which is, again, the I don't see color kind of way of, if we just don't look at it, then what's actually happening will kind of sort itself out because no one will be thinking a bad thought anymore.
Social constructs exist because people want them to exist, or at the very least because we allow them to exist.
Yeah, social constructs exist because we want them to exist or because we allow them to exist. The idea is that people are the ones that determine the social constructs, not the material relations that they find themselves in. So, for example, a really clear one is the move from hunter-gatherer to agricultural society. So, hunter-gatherer societies were matrilineal because that's what the economics of their society lent itself to, whereas agricultural societies were patriarchal because that's what the economics of agriculture, which was like the beginnings of slavery and class and all that kind of thing, lent itself to. It wasn't like, people chose in any kind of conscious way to do this.
If we're going to change them, we have to recognize we do so with the intent of making life better for people. Isn't that what TERFs are always crowing on about? The expectations of femininity? Why should a woman be expected to wear high heels and makeup and what have you? What is that but not challenging a social construct?
It's weird because he doesn't, he seems to suggest like, yeah, it's weird because he's like, you have to come to queer theory to get gender nonconformity. But, aren't feminists always crowing on about gender nonconformity?
The betterment of the people subjected to it.
The thing is, okay, you're talking about the construct as, apart from that's like a moral judgment, versus a construct as an analytic tool to talk about what the disagreement is over. So racism versus anti-racism is a disagreement over a agreed construct, which is race. And anti-racism is race exists as a social construct insofar as its effects are real. A racist is saying, race exists for, all sorts of shitty reasons. And they think that certain races are bad. In a similar way, a misogynist is somebody who says, or any kind of, gender-based socialist, obviously usually it's going to be a misogynist, is going to say, well, gender exists, and there's one gender which is better than the other. And the person who's an egalitarian is going to say, no.
This is the problem because you've used gender as being synonymous with sex, and that hasn't been unpacked, and I feel like there's room for ambiguity.
Gender does exist as a social construct in terms of its effects being real, but there's not one gender that's better than the other. And I don't see how it helps you or helps anyone in any way to then say, well, actually, this disagreement, but also I have a completely different understanding of gender. And in fact, you can be any gender you want based on self-identity. I don't see how...
but you're arguing you're a transphobe. You're making a prescriptive judgment right now. You're not just saying we need to understand gender, because I understand gender just fine. You're arguing that we need to prescriptively assign certain gender roles and expectations to fit with your social preferences.
Yeah, because to acknowledge that sex is a real thing and it has a political implication is to have prescriptive ideas about gender. That's basically what he's saying.
You're arguing you're a transphobe. You're making a prescriptive judgment right now. You're not just saying we need to understand gender, because I understand gender just fine. You're arguing that we need to prescriptively assign certain gender roles and expectations to fit with your social preferences.
Yeah, no, he's not arguing that we need to assign gender roles to people. He's saying that we need to, in the same way that the anti-racist isn't saying we should assign race to people, the anti-racist is saying we should acknowledge that race is a social construct, but there's a material reality to that social construct. And in the same way,
you're arguing you're a transphobe. You're making a prescriptive judgment right now. You're not just saying we need to understand gender, because I understand gender just fine. You're arguing that we need to prescriptively assign certain gender roles and expectations to fit with your social preferences. If you're arguing that we need to have an understanding of gender as it exists, then fine, of course I agree with that. I've never had any trouble whatsoever relating to people's gendered experiences. I mean, I went to school for that crap, kind of. Any trouble whatsoever relating to people's gendered experience.
He's like, I've never had any trouble whatsoever in relating to people's gendered experiences. Like, surely you've had some. It's just so absolute. But then you're almost like famous for having a problem with a particular group of people's gendered experience, that being TERFs, which are essentially like a whole group of women that you've just decided, like, no, the way that you see the world is, and your gendered experience, horrible. Even if you're like a detransitioner or, you know, some other way have been like really harmed by the medical industrial complex that the trans lobby enables. Nothing, you could never be loyal enough. You could never have been loyal enough to be able to think critically about the ideas, because it's just a church.
I mean, I went to school for that crap, kind of.
Was it seminary school? Also, being able to relate to people's gendered experience and being able to meaningfully analyze oppression are kind of two different things. Being like, oh yeah, man, I get you were sad, is like not really, I guess, the purpose of political analysis.
But with regards to improving the social construct, you can only do that by challenging the way it exists now. TERFs do this the same way. When they do this, oh, well, we shouldn't have to wear makeup to be a woman. We shouldn't have to wear high heels to be a woman. Woman is not a performance. Woman is whatever. What they're doing is they're challenging
Woman is whatever.
Existing social construct and saying that their identity shouldn't be subject to rules and regulations placed on them by society. Everyone wants to change social constructs. You're arguing against the idea of improving society.
Marxists see social constructs as being the outgrowth of like the material relations between any society. Even though like the social constructs will change as people kind of resist, changing the construct isn't the main focus, and that's the difference with postmodernism and queer theory, is they think there's this idea that if we could just keep challenging the norms and queering things, then we'll come up with all these fanciful new ideas that will somehow override the actual like material relations of capitalism that are producing the unjust society. Which is ironically really similar to hippies. So in a way, it's like the most boomer thing you could possibly do.
I think it's actually funny you mentioned prescriptivism, because I think that's exactly what you're talking about. You're talking about people wanting to change constructs that say, do this, you should behave this way, this is what you should be like. That's not what gender critical feminists are talking about. Gender critical feminists are talking about the only construct that they're talking about preserving is a construct which doesn't say, do this, or act this way.
Are trans women women?
He breaks.
No.
Yeah, and quit dressing up with your language with academic speak. You're making prescriptive judgments.
It's not a prescriptive. I'm not saying that. Don't do this.
Yes. You are. You're prescriptively saying we should identify, or we should have.
What is? Are they using? So he really gets into the prescriptive judgments. Okay, so you're making a prescriptive judgment. I'm assuming he means like you're saying something should be a certain way. He's making it for the same reason that Vaush is making his argument, because he's saying, like, Vaush's argument is essentially like, there is no truth, so my goal is to minimize harm, and so a trans understanding of gender is the best way to do that, without acknowledging that, he basically acknowledged, but he dismissed in the beginning the concept that, like, gender critical people are doing the similar thing. But I think there's also obviously the reality that patriarchy is about sex-based oppression, which we mentioned earlier.
Have a form of gender. We should have a social construct of gender which prevents people from identifying as this or that. You're making a prescriptive judgment. The difference is...
He's not saying that you should prevent people from identifying. He's just saying that he doesn't identify them as that at this point. I mean, he could go on to later say that, but it's kind of, I don't know, it just feels like at this point he got frustrated and didn't want the discussion to, I don't know. It's about 20 minutes in, so there's a certain amount of fairness.
How does it make it better? How does it make the world better to say trans women are not women?
Well, first of all, I think truth is inherently valuable, and I think that having
it's a social construct. There's no inherent truth value.
Having a logical understanding, a helpful understanding of a social construct is good for the pursuit of truth. I think having one that makes sense. I don't think it makes sense to have a definition of a social construct which is completely foreign to the people who are an oppressive class, which is completely foreign to the history of that oppression.
Again, right now you're just arguing against the idea of changing social constructs. People could have...
No, he's not. What he's doing is saying that the assumption Vaush is making is that it's by changing the social construct that changes the society. Yeah, it's kind of a tricky thing to unpack.
Which is completely foreign to the history of that oppression.
Yeah. So, for example, like, he's saying completely foreign to the history of that oppression. So, in the same way, like, it wouldn't make any sense for us to kind of try to generate a new understanding of race that was sort of just made people feel good, and wasn't really connected to, like, it was kind of like, I don't know, if we just decided Xbox people and PlayStation people were races, and we just decided, yeah, no, that's how we're gonna see race, and we're gonna celebrate it when we see it, and we'll know when we see it because there'll be fanboys there. And anyone who tries to bring up that archaic idea that race has something to do with, like, where you're from, yeah, those people will obviously just be Nazis who don't want to move on to the higher form of race that we've developed. That's kind of what I feel like King Critical is saying that Vaush is doing with, and, you know, all gender theists are doing with gender.
And also
right now you're just arguing against the idea of changing social constructs. People could have adapted your exact same arguments to keeping black women out of white women's faces.
Yeah, this is great, because this is an argument that you often hear from gender theists, and it's, again, presented very emotively. I think King Critical actually does a very good job of challenging this point, but then Vaush does this sneaky thing to kind of neutralize it, so I'll just let the video play.
60 years ago in the US. Everything you're saying right now, well, I'm not against black women. Actually, I just think we ought to recognize the fact that there are historical differences, and we should respect the logical fact that there are differences between these groups. Everything you're saying right now is just reappropriated language of bigotry that could have been used centuries ago between different groups.
It's funny because he said in my ContraPoints video pretty much the exact same thing, that all ContraPoints is saying is that different people have, like, oppressions based on different things, and that might mean that their interests come into conflict. That's all she's saying.
She just says that different marginalized communities sometimes have different material interests, and that sometimes their interests contradict one another, so sometimes that's an issue that needs to be discussed. That's all she said. What the fuck is wrong with you? I'm talking to me, a cisgender white dude.
He's saying that to suggest that different oppressed groups have different, like, material interests means that you're a Nazi. Can only mean that you're a Nazi.
So I ask you again, because utility is what I am concerned with, and there is no truth value to appeal to here.
Utility.
It's all a matter of analysis. Why?
But first of all, I think that it's not the same as what you're saying. What would be the most obvious equivalent, and it's funny you bring up race, because what would be the most obvious equivalent is black women and white women are fundamentally, are different in terms of what race they should be understood as, and that it's not about self-identity, that a white woman can't just identify as a black woman. What you're describing is instigating certain policies based on an understanding of gender, and particularly your example of keeping black women and white women in separate places. And of course, it could be black men and white men, just black people in general.
I'm just adding.
So this is the point where Vaush kind of mumbles under Critical, saying, "What are you talking about? I'm just trying to make the world a better place." Like, he can't comprehend the metaphor, which is ironic because there's another point where he says, "There's no scenario that a TERF could put forward that I can't comprehend." And here he's going like, "What are you talking about? I just want to help people." Critical, he's pretending like he can't comprehend the metaphor that Critical's about to make, and it's because it's going to unravel everything that he's laid. So yeah, he does a very good job of derailing this train of thought right at like the crucial time. What are you going on about? He interrupts here because what's going on about was the point that I also said. Well, did I say it yet? I don't know. Maybe I waited until he said it. But that black women should be able to have their own spaces, and they're not bigots for suggesting that. In fact, the more bigoted idea would be to suggest that black was just a feeling or a particular way of looking, and that if you visually passed for black, that was basically the same as being black, because all the same things of like, you know, someone who would assault a woman would also assault a trans woman. And it's like, yeah, well, someone who would assault a black person would probably also assault Rachel Dolezal. But that doesn't mean that Rachel Dolezal is black. Or even like other people who've, you know, passed better than that. Everything's getting cancelled right now. But there's an Australian comedian called John Safran, and this might be the beginning of his downfall, but he had a TV show called Race Relations, and during one segment he met up with the woman who teaches racism in classrooms, Jane something, and she told him about like Black Like Me, that book where the guy took whatever it was to make his skin darker. And John Safran basically took that idea and like did it in modern day, just using blackface, and met up with like 5%ers and went into all these really kind of racially charged situations, like in disguise, essentially. And so, yeah, you could say that he experienced racism, but he didn't really. Or at least, yeah, I think that broadens the term to the point where you're not actually talking about the oppression of black people anymore. It's just this theoretical wankfest. And simply recognizing that two different groups have different material interests isn't the same thing as saying one group deserves to die. Another point with the black women and white women metaphor in relation to cis and trans women is that black, not only should it be reversed, but I think like the analogy of black and white doesn't really make sense, because with that metaphor, it's like there's nothing white women really, there's no additional, well, using their understanding of patriarchy doesn't specifically affect women. So that's not something that women uniquely experience. Everybody experiences that. So a cis woman, particularly a cis white woman, doesn't really have any oppression because she's white and women aren't really oppressed. A black woman can be, but a white woman basically isn't, because they don't really understand how patriarchy works. So when I've thought about this analogy in the past, I've thought a better comparison would be to, say, black women and Mexican women, and the types of, norms that you would expect both groups to operate with. And one group wouldn't expect to be included in all the other groups' things, particularly if it was to go so far as to actually disrupt what this other group was trying to do. Yeah, but because they don't think women are oppressed, and they have this weird way of making all TERFs white women. But yeah, it's a popular sentiment, I think. It's much more popular than is allowed to be policies
that make the world a better place. I can
What
point to
you're
data to back up all of
describing,
my
what you're describing.
I can point to data to back up all of my prescriptions, because your prescriptions are the prescriptions of capital, and capital, has universities precisely to produce the data that they need for the things that they want to do. That's obviously not to suggest that, critical thought or academia in general is, without value, but to sort of accept it unquestioningly in the way that some people do. It sort of becomes akin to the church issuing a decree. It's like very unscientific to be like, well, the data says this right now on this very new issue. And it's not just, trans that happens with, but there's, a common thing of like people who just like worship data. But yeah, just think that like having a few graphs or having, here's an example. When I first got onto the internet, I hadn't been to university, and I thought that the idea that a article had sources meant that it was infallible. So you come across, and this is a thing conspiracy people kind of exploit to some extent, where they present the kind of trappings of academia in order to make it seem like it's unfathomable that they could be wrong.
Is I'm not saying you're advocating for it. I'm saying what you're describing. You're accusing me, or you're suggesting that me saying gender exists and that it matters that we define it in a way that helps us to best understand the historical.
There is no lack of understanding, but this is the lie you keep falling back on. I don't lack any understanding. There is
yes, you do.
No scenario in which I, as a queer theorist or an intersectional feminist, could not form a decent explanation for or understanding of what's going on. This is the lie you keep falling back on.
But there is like a decent understanding.
And that it matters that we define it in a way that helps us to best understand the historical.
There is no lack of understanding, but this is the lie you keep falling back on. I don't lack any understanding.
I see everything. I don't lack any understanding. My understanding is more complete because I understand archaic race, I understand PlayStation race, I understand foodie race, I also understand transparent gender, I understand floor genders, I understand sky genders. So look at all the understanding that's happening.
There is no scenario in which I, as a queer theorist or an intersectional feminist, could not form a decent explanation for or understanding of what's going on.
Yeah, you could form a decent explanation for what's going on, but it would be from a particular perspective that would inhibit it from being able to perceive the situation in other perspectives. So, for example, like a feminist analysis is going to be able to create a perfectly reasonable explanation, but it's not going to see the same things as a Marxist analysis necessarily if it's a bourgeois feminist analysis. So yeah, just this kind of idea of like, but I see everything. It's like, well, why do you have so much trouble understanding? And you like to say TERFs, a big group of people, like, it's a lot of lesbians, it's a lot of, and in particular, like, detransitioners, and who the detransitioners happen to be most often is women, and there's like the skyrocketing rates of transition among girls and women, and that alone is kind of evidence of the significance of sex, biological sex, in a world where gender exists, but you're not allowed, you're like incapable of seeing it, or at least, if not incapable of seeing it, incapable of recognizing the full political implications of sex. I guess here's how I would describe the way they don't see what's going on. So I think it's like Weber. He has this kind of conception of class where it's like, it's about culture, and like economic class. And I won't even use him, but liberals in general have this understanding of economic class where, yeah, it's often about culture and it's sort of many-tiered. It's based on essentially like the stuff that you like. And that's one way to kind of think about culture, but it's a very sort of bourgeois way to think about class, but it's a very bourgeois way to think about class because it sort of invisibilizes it invisibilizes like the class antagonisms that are at play. So a liberal understanding is able to point to everything. It's not like you could go, well, here's an unemployed former dope dealer. Can you explain that? Like everyone can explain it, but it's certain explanations have better political utility than others.
This is the lie you keep falling back on. Why do we preserve bigotry? Well, because it helps us understand.
It's not preserving bigotry. It's preserving an understanding of the power relations that produce bigotry. That those power relations don't come from any individual's whim. They're like an objective, observable thing, an objective, observable phenomenon.
I understand everything, so you're left with naught but a defense of bigotry. So I ask...
I understand everything, so you're left with naught but a defense of bigotry.
You, why are trans women not women? Why should we not do this thing?
Well, because again, it does not help us. And the thing is, okay,
It helps trans women. It sure as shit helps them.
And who else is there but trans women? And does it sure as shit help them? Because it's a little bit like, I think there are a lot of ways in which trans understanding only helps trans people if you kind of proceed from that understanding. But if you don't accept the premise that there is such a thing as an innate gender identity, then a lot of times what trans ideology is advocating is really harmful to those people that could potentially be identified as trans. And it kind of has always been this way. Like, ever since John Money, there have been doctors who have been going, no, this works, when it clearly doesn't. Or there are clearly, like, much more complicated issues than they're being forthright with, and certainly more complicated issues than, like, someone under 18 can reasonably be expected to grapple with.
You can understand anything within your conception of gender as something being entirely based on self-identity. The question is it useful in terms of making things simpler, making things clearer? Because as I see it,
whoa.
Theory.
Wait, you know what the simplest explanation for black crime in America is? That black people have lower IQs.
Yeah, so he just stepped on that one word to kind of derail the line of argument, as though clarity isn't a significant thing, and as though like the idea that the simplest explanation is often the best, and his assumption that these bizarre like popular conspiracies of the moment are the simplest explanation. They're not simple because they involve a lot of rebutting of common ideas. Like he brings up like the warrior gene or something.
The warrior gene.
Yeah, like most people don't, I think, really believe in that. and the idea that they do because it's the simplest idea. I don't see the logic behind that.
The simplest explanation. Pardon me for not deferring to your anti-intellectual desire to just appease the simplest explanation for people who are looking to justify bigotry. I'm looking to make them...
It's not for people... Yeah, and he's automatically assuming, yeah, it's for people looking to justify bigotry. Not that we're trying to understand the dynamics of racism or sexism or whatever.
World a better place.
And... yeah, he just gets more and more frustrated and more, but I'm the good person, and I've, I guess, blessed you with my presence, and I've given you a chance to hear the Lord's word, and you haven't accepted it. Before you were just an ignorant savage, but now the Lord is very upset with you.
The idea that trying to make things simple is inherently anti-intellectual is stupid. Like, obviously, yes. You
showing the simplicity as an inherent value as opposed to, like, justice or, like, making the world a better place is, yes, very silly.
Here he's assuming that it is counterposed, that simplicity and justice, or simplicity and making the world a better place, in order to say, well, do you want the bunny to die?
But...
it's a false dichotomy, because the argument is that obviously the simplicity would lead to a more just world. It's just that you are so intent on derailing the conversation before anything can kind of get set up that you're able to present it as though it's not the case.
Obviously, yes, simplicity should not come in place of things which help us understand the world, but ultimately, a simpler explanation is easier. It's one which makes it easier to have discourse. It's one which makes it easier to explain things.
The fundamental issue is that
queer theory doesn't explain anything.
That's a really good point, and Vaush then derails it onto something else. But yeah, to come up with a new, modern, more inclusive gender doesn't actually explain how the world works, doesn't explain how the oppression of women works. Just as coming up with the PlayStation race and the Xbox race doesn't actually explain how white supremacy, like the material origins of white supremacy.
Wait, you could say all this about race realism.
Why?
Because you could do the same. It's much easier to explain that black people and white people are just inherently more different. It's very easy to explain. It's very understandable. That's what I'm asking you.
We don't.
That's what I'm asking you.
In terms of evidence, there are places that do collect the evidence to show the negative harms that trans ideology has on women. The problem is, if you do try to collect that evidence, just the fact that you are trying to see if any is there shows that you are bigoted. And if you see any, you have to kind of pick a different explanation. You're not allowed to come up with the explanation that challenges gender theism. One specific piece of information that I can remember is that from 2008 to 2018, there were more people murdered by trans women in the UK than there were trans women who were murdered. They're both small numbers in either case. It's just one country. But yeah, just this assumption that, there must have been hundreds of trans people murdered, and no understanding of how many women are murdered every day. And, no understanding of, for example, prisons, a male prison is a completely different place to a female prison, and its housing often, there are male patterns of offending, and they tend to do with, violent crime. That's why you have, supermax prisons for men, and they don't have those in most places for women. And so, yeah, it's really important, obviously, to differentiate between males and females, and see that, okay, for example, during the Vietnam War, radicals on campus would tell people, tell the army that you're gay, and then you won't have to go to war. And, because, the US Army didn't allow gays. So if hippies in the 60s or 70s are willing to identify as something they're not really to like get something they want, why wouldn't a sex offender who's already in jail and going to go to a male jail have any compulsion about saying, yeah, I'm a woman, particularly when it doesn't have to come with any medical or other kind of interventions? Why wouldn't that be a concern?
Yeah, but hold on. First of all, it's more than that. This is not an evidential question. You can't have evidence for what gender should mean. All you can do is look at the facts we have and ask what explanation best helps us understand this thing.
No. Wait, stop deferring to the understanding. I understand. This is the lie. You keep repeating this. Well, I'm lacking something. I'm lacking some mote of understanding because I engage in queer theory. You realize my job on this channel is convincing people who disagree with me, right? It is literally my job.
It's my job to be repetitive. My job. My job. Repetitiveness is my job.
To understand and disseminate information on these subjects. So your repeated insistence that we should discriminate against
the idea that this sort of counts as a job, but like the idea that these types of debates, participating in these types of debates, like it's my job to convince people. I don't think that's your job, because nobody was convinced in this debate, but that didn't hinder anything, because your job isn't to convince people. Your job is to entertain your audience. That's your job.
Millions of people worldwide, because it leads to an easier explanation. Job on this channel is convincing people who disagree with me, right? It is literally my job to understand and disseminate information on these subjects. So your repeated insistence that we should discriminate against millions of people worldwide because it leads to an easier explanation is extremely unconvincing to me.
But the reason why that's important is because the easier and better understanding of the situation leads to a greater alleviation of the symptoms of the situation, which includes the billions as opposed to millions of women in the world.
You keep deferring back to this. Why should we do something which leads very heavily to the suicidality of a massive group of people? Why should we contradict the evidence and arguments made by virtually every reputable scientific and academic organization on the planet?
This is partial, like this is one of the ways that basically everyone you talk to, they're all about the trans suicide, and yeah, I want to see some data on the suicide stuff, because I think they are massively misrepresenting those statistics, and I think I've already done a video on how like politicizing suicide in the way that the trans movement does, in terms of the way that the trans movement politicizes trans suicide is really similar to the way that Israel politicizes the Holocaust. And I'm probably going to lose some people. But, like there's some quote that, you know, gets passed around where there was like an early Zionist who made some argument to the effect of that he thought it was more important that Israel exist than the actual lives of people in the camps, and that a political solutions that involved saving more people but less Israel shouldn't be pursued in favor of like saving less people for more Israel. So it's like a really cynical way to use that kind of thing. I'm not saying that's the whole thing, but that was like an element of that kind of political arsenal. And it's a similar thing of like, they want the right to exist, and the way they do it is by going like, remember that horrible thing? Yeah, the same thing happens with trans suicide, where it's like, you're not meant to talk about suicide like that because it's dangerous to people who might commit suicide. You're not meant to talk about suicide like it's the logical cause of events for anyone to follow. It's yeah, there's all these kind of like guidelines, and even if there are at-risk groups, you're not meant to go like, hey, this particular at-risk group, you're all at risk of killing yourselves, you know, because there's social patterns to suicide, and they don't report it in the media for those types of reasons. Like, you know, I'll like look at any stats anybody has to show me, but just the way that it's spoken about by a lot of gender theists immediately makes me think like that they don't know a lot about suicide and the best practices. And the thing is, like, yeah, that might not even be the end, like the debate settler, but all of their arguments are so dependent on like, well, do you know what the official royal blah blah says about this issue? And it's like, yeah, okay, well, do you know what the suicide hotline says about like telling at-risk groups that they're going to kill themselves? And the thing is that like there's an actual financial incentive in the same way Israel has, you know, the potential financial incentive, or like cynical Zionists will say, rather than like implicate the whole country of Israel. But yeah, Zionism could have cynically used Holocaust deaths. Transgenderism, like, obviously has a clear, like, if there were 100 trans suicides a day, if there are 100 trans suicides a day next year, then the donation, like, then the money in the non-profit industrial complex around transgenderism would skyrocket. And the thing about that is that no one needs to really be conscious of this happening for that to be the mechanism that's at play. And I'm not suggesting that the, you know, all trans suicides are the result of a mismanaged policy by bourgeois liberals. I'm just saying, you know, just being like, but I'm just trying to make the world a better place. Like, so many people did so much fucked up shit, like, under that assumption. And, you know, blindly picking one group of people, a, like, obvious statistical minority in comparison to the, like, a much larger group of people that you're trying to pretend don't matter.